Hello and welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Elena Casas. Our focus today is on the challenges and issues surrounding ESG investing. And our guest is Dewi John, Head of UK and Ireland LIPA Research at Refinitiv. Well, with climate change and diversity at the top of the agenda for many companies and investors, there has been a huge drive towards investing in environmental, social and governance, or ESG. According to the US Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment, there are 836 funds using these strategies in the United States alone. The same report said $1 out of every $3, that's 17 trillion, was managed according to sustainable investment strategies at the end of 2019. Among many indices tracking the sector, this is the S&P 500 ESG index. As you can see, it's heavily weighted in favour of technology stocks, but it also includes banks, retailers and even oil major ExxonMobil, which last month lost board seats to activist hedge fund Engine No. 1 over its climate change policies. So far in 2021, the S&P 500 ESG index is up about 13%, so not much better than the wider S&P 500. And that begs the question, is this an investment strategy? Well, let's ask Refinitiv's Dewi John. Hello Dewi, thanks for joining us. To start with, how would you even define an ESG investment?
That's a very good question. I don't think there's a very good answer to it, unfortunately. ESG has been defined as the non-financial factors around environmental and social issues that will have a material impact on financial security. Now, I say that, and of course, that covers a whole multitude of sins, and that, if you like, thereby lies the rub.
But you've been looking into some of these big companies that make up the ESG indexes, which are heavily reliant, as I was saying there, on big tech. And that's thrown up quite a few issues, hasn't it?
Well, if you go back 10, 20 years, what investors wanted from an ESG investment was tended to be very, very rudimentary. Is it an oil major? Does it mine coal? Is it selling guns or alcohol or tobacco? If you can put a no against all of those, you have an ESG investment. That's now changing. It's being driven by regulators who want increasingly granular and more specific disclosures on investments right the way across the board. So for instance, water technology stocks, carbon footprint will be, and also large investors, particularly big institutions, pension funds and the like, they also want a lot more disclosure on that. And for a lot of these large tech stocks and others, but it's the tech stocks that have been in the news recently, this has put them, I think, in quite uncomfortable territory. They're having to disclose in a way to get their ESG and green credentials in a way that they're or being asked to disclose in a way that they never have before. And we're seeing a little bit of pushback on that now.
So as regulatory requirements and investor pressure increase, what does it mean for ethical investing in the ESG funds? Are they going to start having to throw out some of these big tech funds if they're not making more disclosures?
As yet, no. Further down the line, honestly, who knows? I think that the direction of travel really is only going one way, and that's for greater disclosure, more specific disclosure, greater transparency on a whole range of issues. So, for instance, if you look at the SFDR, the European Union legislation, where corporates are now being asked to make tens of very specific disclosures on areas that carbon footprint, social aspects, employment behavior and the like, which they've never had to do before. And this is both opening up the books in a way that hasn't been done before and putting a cost on them. And it's interesting that what we're seeing with this big tech pushback is this is coming from the opposite end of the cap spectrum from where you'd normally expect it. Because if you think about the disclosures a company is having to make, whether a large cap, a mid or a small cap, the sort of disclosures are basically the same. So it's actually easier for a large cap to do this than for a smaller cap. And it's why large caps, irrespective of the sector and their record, tend to have a better ESG record because it's easier for them to disclose. Now, if I had to second guess this, I would think that big tech will eventually cave on this. It will have to do it because everybody is going to have to do it in the States, in Europe, and in other jurisdictions.
No, but as you said, a lot of that pressure to be greener is coming from the investors. But is that just about their conscience, or is it because they see this as an investment strategy?
I think it's both, and it's also fear of regulatory action. So if you're sitting, for instance, if you've got a lot of oil majors and coal in your portfolio, and the valuation of that stock or those stocks is done to a very large degree on their reserves, and then the regulators step in and say, actually, you can't touch those reserves if we are going to stay within, for instance, the 2 degrees or 1.5 degree of global warming as specified by the Paris Agreement. What does that do to the valuation of that stock? It will destroy it in all likelihood. So investors have become increasingly mindful of that. And you can think of ESG less about conscience about doing good, although there is certainly that element there. And it's much more about, it's an extra layer of due diligence and risk mitigation.
Thanks so much for that. That was Dewi John, Head of UK and Ireland Lipper Research at Refinitiv. Well, before I go, here are some of the top stories in the sector. Activist hedge fund Engine No. 1 is launching a new ETF with $100 million in assets, betting that investors are willing to invest in its products following its victory over ExxonMobil. Roughly 4 weeks after shareholders broadly supported its call for Exxon to improve its financial performance and overhaul its clean energy strategy, Engine No. 1 is rolling out its Transform 500 ETF, whose ticker will spell out the word vote. It will differentiate itself from the hundreds of similar portfolios by trying to change corporate behaviour through annual voting on proposals such as climate change related or gender pay issues. The cost of renewable energy sources is undercutting that of new and some existing coal-fired power plants. That's according to a report by the International Renewable Energy Agency. The report said the global weighted average cost of electricity from new capacity additions of onshore wind fell 13%. For offshore wind, it fell 9%, and for solar 7%, making it increasingly cheaper than fossil fuel-fired capacity. Between 2010 and 2020, the cost of solar electricity alone fell 85%. And Britain's financial watchdog has proposed a far wider range of companies should adopt global standards for disclosing the impact of climate change on their business. Since 2020, companies listed on the London Stock Exchange premium segment use disclosures written by the Global Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The UK Financial Conduct Authority is proposing to extend its use to companies with a standard listing, asset managers, life insurers and pension providers to help the UK reach net zero emissions by 2050. And that's your roundup of the ESG space. I'm Elena Casas and this is Reuters.